In this video, I'll show you how to construct the bucket hat for the pattern we made earlier. It's fairly straightforward construction, but I'll show you some tips to get a successful product in the end. For this example, I'll be using a plain unbleached muslin, but any medium weight fabric will work. For the lining, I'm using a polyester taffeta. And for the interfacing, it's just a medium weight fusible interfacing. You'll need sewing thread. I'm using a contrast thread so you can see my stitches. You'll also need some millinery belting or petersham. This is a cotton rayon grosgrain that is used as a sweatband on the inside of the hat. You can get it at any millinery supply shop. You'll also need a sewing machine and some pinking shears. You can use a serger if you want, but I prefer a pinking shear on the inside of a hat because it reduces bulk. Using pattern pieces from the previous video, you want to cut out all of your fabric. I'm using a rotary cutter, but you can easily use scissors if you want. You also want to mark all of your notches. I'm using permanent markers so you can see what I'm doing, but you need to make sure you use something that is easily removed from the fabric. I also labeled all of my fabric pieces with their corresponding part names so you can see where everything goes as I'm constructing it. Make sure you mark all of the notches on all of the lining and fabric pieces to ensure proper construction. For the interfacing pieces, I cut them out like normal, and then I cut off a 1/16 of an inch around the entire piece. This just ensures that when you fuse them down to the wrong side of the fabric, that nothing hangs over onto your ironing board cover. You don't have to do this step if you don't want to, but I find that it does help during the preparation process. And remember, whenever you're working with fusible interfacing, you need to follow the manufacturer's instructions to get proper adhesion to the back of the fabric. Otherwise, the interfacing could come off as you're working with it. Please understand, as I am making this example, that I'm using contrast thread and I'm at a weird angle trying to get everything on camera. When you're making your hat, try to use matching thread whenever possible and take your time with it. You'll get a really solid quality product if you'll just take your time with things. So if you see my stitching isn't perfect, it's just because I'm sort of standing on a step stool trying to get everything organized and on camera. Starting with the crown, we're going to fold it in half and we're going to sew the center back seam. Now, this is at the regular 3/8 inch seam allowance for me, and it's just a regular basic seam. Afterwards, you're going to press it open, and then we're going to edge stitch on either side of the seam to give it a nice decorative finish. You don't have to do the edge stitching if you don't want to. I just think it looks more sporty. Once you've sewn your seam, you need to press this open. And yes, use an iron. I'm just going to finger press this just to show you that it does need to be pressed, but whenever possible, use an iron. I'm edge stitching on either side of the seam. I'm doing a stitch that's pretty close to the seam, but you're more than welcome to do any decorative stitching you want back here. Along the top of the crown, just inside the seam allowance, you want to stay stitch. This is going to help us in the next step. You don't have to stay stitch if you don't want to, but I find that it helps if you don't really understand clipping. So now that you have the stay stitching on the top edge of the crown, you want to clip to the stay stitching. And the stay stitching is just a guide to help you not go past it. This is going to help us connect the tip in the next step. Matching notches, center front to center front and center back to center back, put the tip right sides together with the crown. And you're going to pin this at all the notches and in between as much as you feel you need to so we can attach the tip to the crown. Now, there's no rule here that says you have to use one or two pins. Use as many pins as you need. It's your hat. Take your time with it. But just make sure that all of your notches match, and this is why it's very important to mark your notches on your fabric somehow. Because we clipped, it's going to make getting the straightaway of the crown into the curve of the tip way easier. If you didn't clip, you'd be fighting this the entire time under the sewing machine. Continue pinning in the spaces between the notches. When it's all pinned, it's ready to be sewn together. With the tip against the bed of the sewing machine, you're going to be stitching at the correct seam allowance. And because we stay stitched just within the seam allowance, as you stitch, you won't see the stay stitching on the finished product. So just remove the pins as you go and make sure you're not catching any pleats or tucks as you sew around the tip. Backstitch at the beginning and end of the stitch. Once you've completed the seam, double check to make sure you didn't catch any pleats or tucks on the crown. You shouldn't have if you've clipped correctly. And you'll see that it's a nice smooth curve on the inside. Turn the crown right side out and lightly finger press the seam allowance towards the crown. You don't need to use an iron here. The next step is going to ensure that the seam allowance definitely stays in place. We're going to edge stitch, or you could use a top stitch next to this seam. So you want the seam allowance against the crown on the flatbed of the machine, and you're just going to stitch right next to the seam. And notice how I'm spreading apart the seam to ensure I don't catch any pleats or tucks as I stitch. You can start anywhere you want on the crown, but I typically do start at center back, just so the back stitching when I begin and end is towards the back of the hat. When you're done, you'll have a row of stitching all the way around the crown. If you want, you can do a second row of stitching for a sportier look. You're going to then repeat this entire process for the crown lining. The only difference is you're not going to do any top or edge stitching. You can if you want to, but it's really unnecessary. What you are going to do is trim the seam allowance to a scant 1/4 of an inch, and this just helps it fit into the crown better. If you're making these for production, you'll have separate pattern pieces for the lining and the tip with the proper 1/4 inch seam allowance. The crown lining stays in this position. Wrong sides together, you're going to place the crown lining into the fashion fabric crown and pin. I typically just start at center back because it's easier for me to remember where those two seams are. You just need to make sure that you have enough pins around to hold it in place. We're then going to baste these two edges together. I do it by machine, you could do it by hand, it's up to you. But you do want to baste these two edges. The other thing is, when you do this, make sure that the basting stays well within the seam allowance. I typically just use about a 1/4 of an inch because my seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch. You can lengthen your stitch if you want, but it's just to hold these two layers together. This will complete the crown as we need it to be done. The next step is to work on the brim. For the brim, we're going to take two pieces, and I've just labeled one upper center back and upper center front just for your benefit, and we're going to join them on the side seams. We're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch because that's what our pattern says to do, and then we're going to press this seam open. You can finger press it or you can press it with an iron. We are then going to edge stitch on either side of the seam to the outside. You can also do an extra top stitch to the outside of the edge stitch if you want, just for decorative stitching purposes. You're going to repeat these steps for the other two brim sections, and you'll have an upper and lower brim. With right sides together, you're going to place your upper and lower brims against each other, and you're going to pin along the outer edge of the brim. Make sure your notches match and make sure your side seams match. Using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're going to stitch the brim's outer edge. When you're done, you're going to turn the brim right side out. And we're going to have to finger press this edge to make sure it looks good to the outside. And when you do this, you want to roll the upper brim over the under brim. And you see that you have just a slight edge where you can see the fabric from the upper brim. And then when you look at it from the top, you won't see any of that seam. And that's what we want. You're then going to press this with an iron to make sure it's nice and flat for the next step. Make sure that when you're pressing this, you have properly, just ever so slightly, rolled that upper edge to the under edge, so where you don't see that seam when you look down on it. Also, if your fabric is really delicate for any of the pressing, you can always use a press cloth to protect it. To keep things in place, you can use a few pins vertically throughout the brim just to make sure things don't slide on you for the next few steps. Next, we are going to edge stitch all the way around the brim right on that edge. And this is going to be basically like a less than a 16th of an inch away from that edge. And this is just it's really a decorative thing for me. I just think it makes it look nicer and it keeps everything in place. After edge stitching, we need to do some stitches along the brim's shape to ensure that the brim pieces stay together. You can do one of two things. You can either do individual concentric circles leading up to the head size, or what I'm going to show you, which is a concentric spiral that starts from the outside edge and goes all the way up to the head size. This is what's typically done in production and is a little bit faster than doing the individual circles. So starting from the back, because you want to make sure all that back stitching is in the back of the hat, you want to start the stitch and then guide it away from the edge stitching. And it just depends on how wide you want to make these. You can make them up to, I would say 5/8 of an inch. I do just a little bit wider than the presser foot here. And just start stitching, and then you're going to angle away from the edge. And it's just a soft, gentle curve. It doesn't have to be terribly dramatic. In fact, you don't want it terribly dramatic. You do want a soft, gentle curve. And then as you stitch, you're just going to keep going around and around and around, making sure that you keep a consistent distance from the previous line of stitching. Once you get back to where you started from, I like to clip the threads that began the stitching so they don't get caught in any of the other stitching that keeps going around. And you can see here that that curve is coming up. So all you need to do is just keep a consistent distance away from that angled curve as you stitch around. When you get to a section with a pin, just simply remove the pin and continue stitching. Continue stitching in a spiral all the way up to the head size line. You can go within about, I don't know, inside the seam allowance if you want. You can also go all the way up to the raw edge. This is just going to help keep it together for the next step. Once you're done stitching all the way around the brim, this just gets sewn in, so the spiral won't actually look like it's an even line away from the head size. It will actually be at an angle. And again, this is just typically what's done in production because it's a lot faster. Now, I'm not going to do a stay stitch here, but I am going to clip this edge, and I'm making sure to clip within the seam allowance. If you want to do a stay stitch, you're more than welcome to. The clipping here just helps the next step of the process ensure that the brim joins correctly to the crown. So you're going to take the upper part of the brim, which is the right side, let's call it, against the right side of the crown at center back and pin. You're going to pin all the way around. Now, those clips are going to help the curve of the brim fit into the straightaway of the crown. If you have a free arm on your machine, this is a good time to use it. This just makes this next step a lot easier. If you don't have one, you just have to be a little bit more delicate with it, but you can still do it. So place the seam on the sewing machine at your proper seam allowance, and you're going to just stitch around. And the free arm will allow the underside to just roll underneath it a lot more easily. As you sew, make sure you're not catching any pleats on the brim. You want to make sure everything is nice and flat, and as usual, never sew over your pins like I just did. Once this seam is complete, your hat is, for all intents and purposes, a hat. We just need to finish off that seam allowance edge on the inside so it's wearable and nice and neat. At this point, you can either serge that raw edge or do what I do and just pink that edge. I don't really think you need to serge because I do think it adds bulk, but if you're making these for production or if you're doing a lot of these, the serging might be a bit more wash and wear friendly. Now you're going to need your Petersham. So cut the Petersham the length of your head size. In this case, my head size is 21.5 inches. Plus, you'll need to add seam allowance, so I add an extra half an inch for 1/4 inch seam allowance. Join the two raw edges together, and you're going to sew, in this case, at 1/4 of an inch. Once this seam has been sewn, you are going to pink the edges. There's really no reason to ever serge these two edges, as I do think that will add way too much bulk. So I just go ahead and pink these edges just to make sure they're not going to fray on me as I'm working with it. Now you need to press this seam open very flat with an iron. For this next step, what I've done is used a marker on the seam I'm talking about so you can see it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see it against all the other black lines. So the pink line here is what I'm talking about. Now, we're going to be placing the Petersham against this seam onto the seam allowance. We're then going to edge stitch on the Petersham to create a sweatband on the inside. Now, the reason we do this is because this sweatband has been designed to be removed and replaced in case it gets too dirty or you get makeup on it. So I'm matching the seam of the Petersham wrong side against the seam allowance exactly at center back. I'm going to pin all along the seam allowance edge. And remember, I am pinning this, the edge of the Petersham exactly on that seam line that I have outlined in pink, to where you can't really even see the pink all that much. So think about it as just like a breath away from the actual stitching line into the seam allowance. And when we stitch, we're going to be stitching exactly on that sawtooth edge of the Petersham. On the inside, you can see the seam that connects the brim to the crown, and that is where we're going to be sewing onto the seam allowance just inside that seam. You do not want this Petersham too far into the seam allowance or too far into the brim. You really want it right there on that connecting seam. Again, it helps to have a free arm on your sewing machine to do this, as the rest of the hat just rides underneath it, but this can still be done on a flatbed machine. Just take your time and make sure you're not catching anything underneath it. It really helps here to use matching thread. I'm using contrast thread so you can see what I'm doing, but matching thread will hide a multitude of mistakes. Although I'll show you how to fix your mistakes in just a second if you do fall off the edge of the Petersham. Now, as you go along, take your time. You want to make sure you do not cross into the hat, and you don't want to come up too far into the seam allowance. Just remove the pins as you get there and take your time doing this stitch. And you can see here that I fell off the edge of the Petersham. It's not a problem. If you're using matching thread, you'll never see it, but go back and just stitch over the place that you did not catch the Petersham. And again, in matching thread, you will not see this. I cannot stress here enough about taking your time. Again, I'm rushing just to show the demo, but when you do this correctly, it will be nice and neat. And the more you do it, the more it'll make sense. For this, you can see that that's where I stitched, and it just caught that edge of the Petersham. It goes all the way around, and yours will look a lot better because you'll be able to take your time with it. I was kind of rushing here, but you get the idea. And you can see on the finished example, that is white stitching on white Petersham, and if there's a mistake there, you'll never see it. Once you're done stitching, push the Petersham into the cavity of the crown. The next step we're going to do is to press the Petersham and that seam flat. So with an iron, you're going to press the Petersham into the cavity of the crown, and this just helps it stay in place more. And then once you're done with that, turn it to the outside and press the seam flat that connects the brim to the crown. Again, this just makes it look nice and keeps everything nice and crisp. Once you're done with that, you're going to press the brim. Keep the brim flat against the ironing board and just go around making sure it's nice and evenly pressed. That completes the construction for the basic bucket hat. The Petersham stays like this as it's worn, and remember, it was stitched like this so it can be easily replaced if it gets dirty or you get too much makeup on it. You just have to pick the stitches and replace it. The stitches on the brim will allow you to hold shapes in the folds of the brim. So if you wanted to have the brim like flopped up, you could do that, or you could have it down in the front and up in the back. Just remember that if you have a really wide brim, you're probably going to want to go with a little bit of a heavier interfacing if you plan on shaping the brim while you wear it. And that's it. That completes the construction of the bucket hat we patterned from the previous video. I hope you've enjoyed learning how to make this and look for more millinery videos in the near future. Thanks for watching.